But there's not actually a specific thing that he is asking for yet. Merely to have judgment in his favor, merely to be vindicated in whatever his case is. It starts non-specific, and he will actually get into the specifics more later in the psalm as he continues his request. But initially, it's just simply for a simple vindication. In what exactly is still a little vague. We can move to the next bullet, or I'm not sure what to call these. Sentence, line. There is a sense of urgency that gets communicated through the use of the imperative verb. This isn't a request. This is the same sort of way that you would phrase a command. Again, not that he believes he has the right to command God, but in the same way that we would shout, help, using that strong imperative tone and form to demonstrate the urgency of the need that we have. And that is what the author is doing here with his verbs in the first two verses. Vindicate me, test me, try me. He is desperate or very in great need of this to occur. So the use of an imperative verb communicates the urgency of the writer. All right, we roll on to, oh yeah, please.
He asked for kind of a kickback on how he's doing. To me, it's almost asking God to let him know how to done, which would be nice, in our life, it doesn't work that way. So halfway through, it'd be nice to do it. How are we doing on our way, on our journey,
Sure. It's sort of a lifetime equivalent of the mid-year evaluation at work, kind of, here's your feedback on how well you've performed so far. I can see how that would be. On the one hand, that would be, I think that, sure, that'd be nice. It would be good to know. On the other, I'm a little nervous about what it would contain. The number of things that I would be told about myself that I had. Perhaps, yeah. I had not thought about it quite that way. I would need to think about that a little more. Again, my inclination is to be more nervous about what I might learn, maybe than hopeful about my ability to find out good things or even to correct what is wrong. Yeah, interesting. The next, words in verse 3, the verbs here, it depends on your translation how these are done. And the one that I was reading from, it has I have walked, and then I have not sat, or I have not wavered. So it speaks of these in the past tense. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, for the second line there, David says, I've led a blameless life. I mean, he committed a lot of sins.
Sure.
That's quite a statement.
Sure. And so back in verse 1, I've led a blameless life. In what sense could that be something that he would feel comfortable saying or writing? Why would David say, I have led a blameless life? Okay. You don't think he's saying that? Okay, what is he saying? Okay. So it's, I guess, like a form of poetic hyperbole, in a sense. Okay. Like he is exaggerating, speaking of it in kind of that way as for effect, in some sense. Were you going to?
I didn't hear him clearly, so I might be saying the same thing.
Sure, no, that's fine.
I think because we got to understand too is throughout the Bible, it said all of them, and we've learned that it doesn't mean every last single individual, but the vast majority. Frequently, when it says all, and blameless may not be as we know it today, as that I've never committed any sin.
Mm-hmm.
but as in, I have tried my entire life to do what's right.
Yeah, and there's a sense in which we are all, right, we think of ourselves, depending on the context, as either sinful or sinless, right? That I am a sinful person, that I have sinned against God, that I have done what is wrong, that I am deserving of judgment and punishment. But God is merciful and gracious, and I have repented and put my faith in his Son, and therefore I am blameless. I will be held to no account because of what God has done for me in his grace and mercy. Yes, yes. And so David, or the author, again, this.
So what he's saying is his sins are forgiven. But that was before Jesus was crucified.
Sure, but there is the sacrifices that they made, even then, in order to not be held guilty of the sins that they committed, that God offered them a way to wash out or to push away the sin that they had through the sacrifices that were made, that were laid down in the law. Essentially, and I mean, we can spend the whole class talking about how that relates and interacts with the coming of Christ in the New Testament, the insufficiency of the sacrifice. I mean, we could turn this into a study on Hebrews very fast, and I would love that because I love Hebrews. But we're supposed to be doing Psalms, and in that context, yeah, I think that one, it is a bit of an hyperbole, right? That when you're writing this in a poetic form, saying that I am blameless is a way of saying I am not or ought not to be subject to judgment because I am obeying the rules that you have laid down. That I do not sin, or when I sin, I follow the sacrifices that you have laid down to expiate that sin, and therefore I am someone who is obeying God, right? Either in the keeping of the commandment or in the sacrifices forgiveness for forgiveness when I break a commandment. And my position vis-a-vis God, my relationship to God, is one where I am not being held to blame. Now, it's of course, long way of putting that, and it is much simpler and probably fits with his meter in his song, much nicer to say, I am blameless. But I don't think that he or his hearers would have understood that to say, I have lived a perfect life, right? It is a ridiculous thing to say. And so I'm not sure that we are supposed to understand it in that same way. Yeah. The point with these verbs was going to simply be that it is a continuous thing rather than a past tense, which you see in some translations, right? That it is the perfect sense of the verb that I walk, meaning I have, I am, and I will walk and act in this manner. Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say, is that you got the next line, it says, and I will do this. So it sounds to me more like he's saying, I have not in the past and I do not now.
Right, and that is again the verb form within specifically in.
That's what that means.
Yeah, this is my problem with not having the verse reference. I should have put it in there exactly. Is it 3? Is it 2? Anyway, but yes, that he is the perfect sense of that verb. I walk in your ways, which we can understand to mean both have, am, and will. It is a continuous state. Yeah. All right. Get out of the first 2 verses here. In 2, the refine and the purify. This is used in the same sense as that of metal, frequently of silver, which is the way that they did 2 things at the same time, essentially. 1, it determines its current purity, but 2, that same process makes it more pure. That it both takes what is there and shows you what flaws, what sorts of other things adulterate that substance, but the method of doing this then refines and makes it more pure as you go through that process also. And then the next point here is that this is actually a fairly common kind of analogy, speaking of God and his people. For example, famously, or maybe not famously, but one I remember frequently is in Psalm 139. This comes up again. But this is a term or a way of expressing that God uses things that are difficult and trials, because the refining process was that you had to heat the metal up so hot, you melt it, that the process could be painful and difficult, but that you would emerge from that better. That the difficulties experienced in life, by analogy, that things that God allows us to endure remove the negative elements of our character, or are intended to remove those, so that we emerge on the other side more faithful, more holy, more in tune with with who God wants us to be. So it is not just the testing, it is the testing and then the thereby refining to become better than we were, which again would contradict an interpretation of blameless as being, I am already as perfect as I can possibly be through my own actions, because a perfect person requires no refining. There's nothing to improve. And he immediately contradicts that idea. So, all right. I want to move on too quickly, but there's just so much here. So verse 3 resonates with 1, I would say. It speaks again of walking. It speaks again of, in this case, truth, whereas in verse 1 it was integrity, which is a similar concept. And this is not the last time that he will actually return to this in this psalm. That walking, and specifically in what is true and with integrity, is an action of this person, and that this is the truth which belongs to God. It says in this translation that I have here, in your truth, NIV has it as well. And we hear those two words at least, a lot more frequently today than perhaps we used to. People speak of my truth and your truth and so forth. How does he mean us to understand when he says that he is walking in your truth, addressing God? Are there multiple truths?
There's multiple false truths.
False truths. That's a wonderful little way to phrase that. What do you mean by that? False truths.
People who proclaim something to be the truth that isn't.
Okay, sure. People are mistaken or duplicitous about what is actually true. Yes.
I like the idea of saying it as a worldview. So he's saying, I'm walking in God's truth, God's view of the world, God's set what right is and what wrong is.
Mm-hmm.
So from his point of view, that's what I'm walking in. That's the path. He keeps talking about God's leading me in the path, or I'm walking in the path of God. So he's setting it from God's point of view. It's not just me. It's not my world. It's not my truth, as in what I made up, what I make believe my life to be.
Sure.
It's the real whole truth from God.
Okay. The perspective of God. Was there someone that I saw? No. Okay. Yeah, this is an interesting way of saying this. And I understand, I think, what you're saying when you're saying from the perspective of God. What is interesting about this is when he speaks of God and God's truth, or your truth that I will walk in, it doesn't imply that there are other kinds of truth, but that, as I wrote on the screen, that it belongs to God, that God himself is the truth, and the way that God acts, the way that God intends, the things that God does are true things, that God determines the truth of the world. It is God's truth, not in the sense that he is making it up as an alternative among many, but that he dictates what reality is. And that to align with truth is necessarily to align oneself with God. Because that is who God is. He is the ultimate expression of truth. Because God's intentions are reality. Right? If we go back to Genesis, where God is creating the universe and the world and everything that exists in it, he says, "Let there be light." And what happens? There is light. That his intention becomes reality. That as God intends a thing to be, so that thing is. And so the best that we can do is do our best to understand the intentions of God in whatever limited way we can accomplish, and thus align ourselves with the truth and the reality that exists within the world. It is a distinction that we should make between it and fact. This is a little hobby horse of mine that I really like to ride, and so I hope I will not bore you with this. But we far too often conflate fact with truth. It is not true in any meaningful sense that the earth goes around the sun. It's just a fact. It doesn't matter. If the earth did not revolve around the sun, how would that affect how we must live our lives? Only in trivial, non-moral ways. It would affect the physics of our universe, but not the truth about who we should be and how we should relate to our fellow man and how we should relate to God. It's not true in the same sense that saying it is true that you should love your neighbor as yourself. That is true. The other is just a fact. Which is why, for me, when I think about it this way, I don't really get that worked up about things that some people find very, very distressing. Some people get really worked up about flat earthers, right? If you've ever been on the internet, you've probably seen it. There are people that believe the earth is flat, or at least claim to. Maybe some of them do, maybe some of them don't. And you know what? I don't care. I don't care. You can believe the earth is flat. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Does it stop you from loving your neighbor? Does it stop you from worshiping the Lord of all creation? Does it make anything that God has done for us less glorious and magnificent? Does it take away from the sacrifice of Christ? I don't think so, so I don't care. I don't care. No, I don't think that's a fact. I think the world's round. But I don't care what facts other people think are true, they believe are accurate, for almost anything.
That's a good example of whether something is true or false. You nor they can indefinitely prove one or the other, right? And so that we accept that it's unimportant, right? I mean, whatever soapbox you get on doesn't matter. Ultimately, they can't prove it's flat. You can't prove it's round. Although you can both argue your own points as to why you believe that and the proof that you have, correct?
Mm-hmm.
But you can't go up there and go see it's round, I told you so. No more than they can go see it's flat, you fell off the edge, right? So it's the kind of thing that's not a truth at all. It's an understanding, it's a belief. But what we're talking about here are truths that cannot be wavered.
I would differ slightly, but I think we're 90% in agreement here, which is to say that there are plenty of facts that you can prove are true, right, in the sense of the trivial sense of true. But again, most of them just don't matter. People can be mistaken about provably, demonstrably things that are factual, right? You can believe that it is a fact that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar played for the Knicks. Now, you could probably demonstrate that fact to be completely in error, right? You can talk to the man himself. You can go back and look at team records. You can do all these kinds of things. right? You could demonstrate that that is a fact that is incorrect. But whether or not it is incorrect or correct, again, doesn't raise it to the level of truth, right? Perhaps I can prove that the world is in fact round. It doesn't make it any less of an inconsequential fact from a moral standpoint. God is truth, God is moral, and the facts about the world, whether the world is round, whether the world is flat, whether the world is cube-shaped, are immaterial to whether or not God is Lord and sovereign of the universe and that he sent his son to redeem a flawed and fallen humanity. The truth of the gospel, the good news for mankind, unaffected by these kinds of facts. Yes?
So you regularly look at different translations. The ESV translates that as walking in your faithfulness.
Okay.
Does it have the same meaning as truth?
No. I'm not going to say that any of these translators messed up. They're all far more knowledgeable about these languages than I. There are, this is of a piece again with there are three instances where it speaks of walking in integrity, here walking in truth or faithfulness, and walking in the integrity that comes up again later in the psalm. In this case, it makes sense to translate that as faithfulness if we're understanding truth in the sense that we remain true to someone, right? That we use this phrase in English, right? That I am true to my word. What does that mean? Well, I remain faithful to what I have said and I do not deviate from it, right? That God is true also in this sense, that God does not change, he does not dissemble or lie, and then thereby is faithful to what he has spoken and said that he will do. And continuing to walk in God's faithfulness is to say, I depend on what God has told me and rely on him to be true to his word and faithful in his pronouncements. Yeah.
So walking in God's truth is really important because back in the garden, we saw God with Adam and Eve and teaching them the truth and walking in that. And every day would come and walk with them and explore that relationship again and explain their life and all those kind of things. And then Satan comes along and says, yeah, but that's not the real truth. Here's something else. You ought to think of it this way. And deceives Eve and Adam to violate that. And then here, a couple thousand years ago to us, Jesus comes to reiterate what is the truth, how to walk in it, how to live a life as man. And then the Christians after that were noted as people of the way, of the path that God had taught them. And I think it's really cool how this word walking in truth keeps cropping up in the Bible, how he keeps reiterating it. And just looking in the references, 2 Kings or Psalm 86, it talks again about I'm walking in your truth and I'm doing it your way. And it just is so exciting to see that it just keeps coming up again and again, and how people are trying to emulate God and follow him in that walking.
Yeah, it's a strong metaphor that you find in multiple cultures in different places around the world to speak of a way or a path, and that to walk is analogous to a way to live, or a way to be, have to set something as your goal or your guide and move in a direction towards that. Yeah, it's a powerful metaphor that gets used frequently. Yeah. All right, well, let's see if we can get to verse 4. Verse 4 reiterates these points, but it simply flips it into making it a negative assertion. So we have spoken of what he does do. He does walk, he does follow the truth of God or the faithfulness of God, aligns with it. But then he also says that I do not do these things. I have not, or do not sit with men of falsehood, neither do I go into dissemblers. I hate the assembly of evildoers, and I will not sit with the wicked. In verse 4 and 5, he reiterates what he was saying before, but by simply countering it with the negative opposites, right? With the opposite of it by saying, I do not do these things. I do this and not this, and they both go hand in hand as emphasizing his conduct. We could flip one more. He speaks in verse 5 of hate or abhorrence. This is a very visceral revulsion. This is an extremely strong word, speaking of his intense feelings of revulsion, of just being repulsed by what it is that the evildoers are about and what they do and the lives that they lead. It produces not simply a decision in him, right? I decide I'm not going to go that way, but an actual reaction of repulsion. You can almost think of it like a magnetic poles, right? That when you put them together in the wrong way, there's just a strong push off. You cannot or will not, or it's difficult to contemplate even doing these sorts of things. This is how strongly he speaks of it. Excuse me. See if we can get to now this. Yeah, I was going to be washing in innocence, but the evil in the world cannot be fully avoided. This is an important point with 5, is that he doesn't say that he can completely avoid where it is, right? That the world is something that we cannot escape, but he can refuse to be complicit. He will not sit down there. That even when you must pass through or be around that which is abhorrent to you, you can still not become part of it, join with it, give it your approbation and approval in any way. He will not sit down with them. He will not pause or join them. What does it mean to wash hands in innocence? Not directly to Pilate, I don't think. But Pilate does use this same sort of idea when we see him at the trial of Jesus in the Gospels.
You're not red-handed if you wash the blood off.
Yes. But he's washing his hands in innocence. Is he innocent? Yeah, there's almost two ways to understand this verse. One is that he is washing and now has become innocent, right? That he is being cleansed by God, by his adherence and his loyalty to God and what the laws that he follows, the sacrifices, and is now washed and made clean. Or that he is washing his hands because he is already clean, that he is doing this as part of a ceremony, but he is already clean. And I also, and this is probably just me, I didn't find any real support for it in the translations that I looked through. I love the idea in my own mind that he is washing his hands with innocence. That innocence is being used to clean it. That in fact, God, who cleanses him from sin, is himself without fault, without blame, and that innocence of God that we experience as well, right, through Christ, the blood of Christ, his innocent blood, the innocence of his nature, then cleanses us. I have to think about that some more to really make sure I'm comfortable with that, but as an idea, it was very exciting to me to think about. Yeah.
Well, he's also talking about going before the altar, and the priests, when they went up to the altar to offer sacrifices and prayers for the people, always washed in the basin before they went in. And they were washing in their innocence. They were already, before they went up, already asked for prayers of God and asked for forgiveness and really made sure their clothes were clean. Their heart was clean. In innocence, then they would go up through the ceremony, washing their hands, entering in, and often the people looked for the priest to come out. Did he have blood guilt on his heart? Did he actually have sins and he went in there and now before the throne of God he is destroyed and killed? And so the priests were very careful to have the clean garment, to have the clean soul, to have the clean heart, the clean mind before they even started the ceremony, so that they would not become guilty of something.
Yeah,
for God be heard.
it's a powerful, again, metaphor
Yeah.
of again, both cleansing, but also separation from, right? That Pilate uses it this way. Someone referenced Pilate. The separation of Pilate from what is happening, right? That I am washing my hands of this matter. I have nothing to do with what is about to take place, right? And in the same sort of way, right, that we have him washing his hands produces that separation from the people of the world, what is outside, as he comes in to the altar. Yeah. All right, I am definitely out of time. We only got through 4 or 5 verses here, but are there anything further on that anybody wanted to talk about? Anything we've already mentioned that's like, no, go back, Ryan, that didn't make sense? I'm going to move on. There's no way I'd ever have a hope of getting through Psalms if I didn't do it this way. I will just say that there is a third verse, speaking of near the very end, in verse 11, speaking of walking, I think it's in 11, walking with integrity again, he returns to that same phrase. So it's used 3 different times, this walking with truth or with integrity in this particular psalm. But thank you for your patience. And my running a little long, and we'll move on to another psalm.